Okay, welcome to the 76th episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm speaking to Patrick Eamon Mills. Pat is an English comic writer and editor who, along with John Wagner, revitalised British boys' comics in the 1970s and has remained a leading light in British comics ever since. He has been called the godfather of British comics. His comics are notable for their violence and anti-authoritarianism. He is best known for creating 2000 AD and playing a major part in the development of Judge Dredd, who was inspired by some of the abusive and violent monks at his Catholic boys' school. He also writes film treatments, screenplays, novels and features, notably on World War I, and is known for the documentary drama Charley's War. Welcome, Pat.
Great to be here.
So how I love to begin the episode, a big shout out to Naomi Murphy for introducing us, kind of letting me know. I'd love for you to just share some of your journey. What drew you into the work you're now doing?
Well, as a writer, I'd always wanted to be a writer from a very early age. I think I got my first short story rejected from the BBC at the age of 9. I thought, time's running out, because there were, I'd read about someone else who'd had a story accepted at the age of 8. I was that sort of precocious, if you like. And so I'd always wanted to be a writer. Skipping over the school period just for the moment, I left school at a remarkably early age, at the age of 15. And so then I think I essentially was self-taught, and I got a job as a trainee journalist with a publishing company in Scotland called DC Thomson's. DC Thomson's do newspapers, magazines, you could describe them really as a center of popular culture. And that's something that's not entirely understood in quite the same way in England, because there's a little more snobbishness in England towards popular culture. So DC Thomson's the home of comics like Beano, the Dandy, Jackie back in the day, and so forth. And it gave me a love of popular culture. And I went freelance and started writing in a garden shed, and discovered that I could make a good living at writing comic strip, which, without getting too deeply into it, would be science fiction, fantasy, horror, and also what would be termed, probably not so much today, but it's still an applicable term, what would be termed girls' comics. Stories about emotion. So it gave me quite a good introduction, and I edited and produced various publications, and I've been doing it ever since. But I think the important thing, which may indirectly relate to where we go on this, is that it is very much about popular culture with working class protagonists. Which doesn't, if you look at popular culture, you will see invariably that they are middle class or upper class. James Bond went to Eton. I don't know where Sherlock Holmes went. Maybe Westminster, maybe Eton, I don't know. Maybe Conan Doyle didn't say. But all the icons of fiction, of adventure fiction, invariably are middle or upper class. And it's my particular trademark that mine are working class for all sorts of reasons, some of which will overlap into where we're going, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, my son My stepson, he's in his mid-30s. He loves your comics. He's very much into his graphic novels, and
Well, that's great.
I used to be quite into them in my teens while at boarding school, but since my breakdown, I kind of I left a lot of that to one side.
Sure.
So that was So I guess the second question I have, would you be able to talk a little bit about your upbringing at Catholic school? How was it?
Oh, yeah. I'm getting better at summarizing it because essentially my survival technique, and I'm speaking as a survivor of Catholic sexual and physical abuse, would be to just block it out. And I still have that sort of capacity even today. And it has its advantages and its disadvantages. But anyway, where it hit me, it didn't hit me at all. I mean, I knew that my childhood was abusive, but I didn't really go into it. I just put it to one side. And I know other survivors and other old boys at my school and similar schools will use phrases like, let's not open Pandora's box, or let's not go there. That's a really standard thing for a lot of people. And so when I was in my early 40s, the memory started coming back. And again, I think that's quite commonplace. And so I sort of thought to myself, well, there's probably one bad priest or one bad whatever. Right, I'm gonna go in for some therapy, get this out, put it behind me. And as I got more and more into it, I suddenly realized that it was almost a bottomless pit. In other words, I was thinking, but all these things couldn't happen to me because I'm not an alcoholic. I have an aversion to drugs. And, I'm relatively stable, as stable as any writer is. So anyway, it took me from, if you like, from that era to now to really put the whole story together. And I would say, and I say this with a certain smugness of a writer, I think I've actually got a continuous narrative now, so that when occasionally some other nugget of information comes up that I hadn't recalled, it kind of hits me sideways. In other words, there's a bit of Pandora's box I didn't open. So that, if you like, is the background. So to sum up the Catholic experience, it's different to a lot of Catholics because I was indentured to the Catholic Church. Now, I would imagine only a small number of Catholic survivors were actually indentured. It doesn't mean to say that their experience could be just as awful as mine, but the emphasis is different. Now, what that means as indentured is, I was property. I belonged to the Catholic Church. Now, some of that is on record. In other words, it's a tradition in Irish families in particular, especially the part of Ireland my mother came from, that you dedicate your child to God. Now, that all sounds fine. That just sounds, what's the difference between that and baptism? But there's a big difference. And there's a lot of phrases that are used in Catholicism which sound innocent, like dedicating your child to God. What can be so bad about that? It's bad because you are their property and they can do with you what they like. I can come back to that, but just to give you a context, my mother's an Irish Catholic widow. She had no resources. She had been mentally ill for over a year in a hospital after the death of her husband, and she had no job. And we lived on a council estate, and yet, despite this, my brother and I went to an extremely posh Catholic grammar school for a total of 9 years. Mm. And it's one of the things I think that perhaps happens to all survivors is you think, well, you know, okay, so how it's only in later life that you start doing Sherlock Holmes and you say, well, wait a minute, how is that possible? And then you start probing your relatives and you come up against carefully rehearsed answers, which in this case is, well, the church paid for your school fees. And so then you say, well, why would they pay for my school fees and my brothers and so on? Because the other thing, of course, it's better we all learn as early in life as possible is there is no such thing as a free lunch, particularly where the Catholic Church is concerned. There is no free lunch there. So that in itself, essentially, it's a license to abuse. It's part of being part of church property. And as I say, I can come back to that. But in effect, I went to a Catholic primary school, which was a typical state primary school run by nuns, which was brutal, abusive. And it's at that very early age that I was first a whistleblower, which I think the normal way Catholics approach this is to just beat it out of you, but they failed where I was concerned. I think it's so much a trademark of mine that if anyone who knew me from any period in my life, they would immediately label me as a whistleblower. Not just where Catholicism is concerned, where other things are concerned. It's just who I am. It's a survival technique, I suppose. And I think I was fortunate that there's always a plus for the negative here. My mother being, what shall we say, you know, having mental health problems and being very much under the influence of the Catholic Church, groomed by them. There's a plus side to that too, because it meant that I was quite feral. And indeed, I think my brother was as well. He was my older brother. So in other words, you become quite resourceful and quite self-contained. And that's not altogether bad, because it means you work out the answers for yourself. In other words, you know that the answers are in here and they're not in the so-called holy books of these religious frauds. And once you realize that at a very early age, you learn all kinds of quite complex survival techniques, like where you put on a facade and you pretend to go along with stuff. And I mean, I've seen this with adults in a particularly a rather oppressive Islamic country, where they, in front of the mullahs, they will behave in a particular way, and once the mullah's gone, they just become an ordinary human being again. And I think this is something that people do if you are in an oppressive religious state or in an organization. And this applies to Catholics. I'm sure it's true for Scientologists, Mormons, maybe Jehovah's Witnesses. They will unfortunately destroy a number of people. People will get destroyed by this. But then you have people like me and people like these dear friends of mine in this Islamic country, who we almost take a delight in beating the system. So it creates a kind of dark humor, dark comedy around it. I mean, I'll give you one example. Predictably, of course, I'd be an altar boy. Now, the altar boys in this church, St. Pancras, Ipswich, Suffolk, before my time, it was already established as a nickname. We called us Rhubarb Club, which comes from the Goon Show. Rhubarb, 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 meaning it's crap, meaning it's all rubbish. So you have this kind of almost Monty Python-esque resistance, almost trench humor towards the whole thing. So moving on from there to my secondary school, this very posh Catholic grammar school, not a public school, like a couple of notches down from it, I would imagine. Where, well, dealing with, first of all, the most obvious aspect, perhaps, what did I get out of it? You know, what do you achieve? I mean, bearing in mind, I left prematurely, which at the age of 15, which I guess I should come back to. You get a superiority complex. And I mention that because I think that's fundamental to, I mean, most, if not all, boarding schools are quote unquote posh. And it gives them a control over you. You owe that school, right? And probably the only reason I'm rather different to the rest is because that education was not complete. And therefore, but if it had, I might have thought, well, it was pretty bad, but, you know, I got my education, so I owe them something. And I think that's how it works. So it's only the mavericks who something happens to them, or they leave abruptly, as I did, who really start questioning things. So that's actually an advantage. I don't think I felt that when I was 15. My God, did I not feel it. It really felt like the end of the world. And that's one of the hardest memories to get feelings to get back in touch with, because I don't feel it today, obviously, but it's to feel what that 15-year-old boy felt. And that was not good. That was not good. In essence, it gives you a superiority complex, because when you go for a job, they look at your CV and they say, ah, he went to St. Joseph's, you know, St. Joseph's College, Ipswich. You know, you've almost got the job just on that kind of old boys network. And if that applies, I mean, it applies to just about every boarding school, because most boarding schools are posh. And so that, if you like, was that aspect. The second recollection of that era, and this again is an interesting survival technique, because the boarders, I was a day boy, so it's boarders and day boys. I lived, my council estate was literally just down the road from St. Joseph's. And the boarders would delight in telling us day boys all the awful things that happen. There's kind of, it's that not so much trench humor, but it's a sort of, you know, they're just trying to they're saying, oh my God, last night was terrible. The De La Salle brother was wandering the dormitory at night, feeling up kids, all this kind of stuff. And you could see some of it going on, some of the references. And it always tended to be the boarders, or at least that's what I thought. And that's my conscious memory until I was in my 40s, when my soul or my subconscious said, no, wait a minute, Pat. You did not get off so lucky. You did not escape. So they would tell you all these horrible, horrible stories. And I would always think, or part of me would always think, well, I'm a day boy, so I'm all right. But that actually isn't true. And this applies possibly, and the reason I'm mentioning it is because it may well apply to other schools where survivors were in that kind of combination of day boys and boarders, because you think you're okay compared to these terrible, terrible things that are happening to boarders, and you know, really quite awful. And the reality is that St. Joseph's College, Ipswich, there was systemic abuse. That means it's organized. It's a little bit more than that. I think we've gone now beyond that one rotten apple syndrome. You know, I think 10 or 15 years ago, I think the Catholic Church was still, I don't know, backed into a corner, still saying, well, it's the one rotten apple. Everybody knows now it's systemic. It's been proven, and with academic studies, in every country in the world, apart from Britain. I mean, I have 4 examples of, I mean, it's organized crime. I mean, systemic abuse doesn't sound quite so bad, and it is bad. We're talking organized crime, pedophile rings, this kind of stuff. Now, these pedophile rings exist everywhere in the world, and they're proven in every imaginable way. In Britain, they're still not acknowledged. And I have personal knowledge of, and from checking with other survivors, I know of 4. And I'm quite sure that compared to other countries, I'm sure it's exactly the same as the others. But we haven't reached that point yet where certainly the Catholic Church in Britain acknowledges paedophile rings. Now, the nature of them is difficult to pinpoint, because how does it work? And I can only say, as a survivor of this system, that I think it works on fairly straightforward principles. It's Occam's razor. You can go from A to Z on this pretty simply. Number 1, you pick on vulnerable kids. So they think, in my case, hey, he's been, whether they knew I was dedicated to God is another matter, but 1, his school fees are being paid. He owes us. 2, his mother has mental health problems. She's a single parent. Single parent is almost a prerequisite, you know what I mean? Because these people are also cowards, not exclusively so, but you know, if your dad's a fireman or a copper or something, they're going to think twice, maybe. So the vulnerability is an important factor. And of course, I think the definition of a paedophile ring is that they pass information from one to the other, and so on and so forth. And it's actually worse than that. One of the worst aspects of it, I think, is that I thought naively, you know, when maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I thought, well, it's a Catholic paedophile ring. I almost thought, because Catholics, the first thing my mother would say if I made a new friend at school was, is he a Catholic? You know, in other words, it's an exclusive thing. And certainly in the past, they didn't like Catholics marrying Protestants and so on and so forth. But, you know, you've only got to look at Northern Ireland to see just how disastrous that system is. But where paedophiles are concerned, oh, they overlap. Oh, yes, they do. And yeah, so you have, if you like, well, you wouldn't even call it, you call it a secular paedophile ring, where they just happen to, you know, exchange notes and, hey, this kid's available, and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of background. But coming back to me as a day boy, I was at risk and was in danger from Catholic lay teachers. I can only be 100% sure about 2 of them, and 2's probably more than enough. But there's a drawback here, and it's hard to say, oh, one would envy boarders, because how can you envy the fact that you're at the mercy of these scum, you know, at night? I mean, but there is one tiny advantage you guys might have, is you're more likely to have witnesses. Whereas if you've got a lay teacher who's arranging to meet you in town, there's no witnesses. So when when I put a call out, I run a survivors blog, and when I put a call out to say, does anyone remember so-and-so, or it's only the boarders who have memories, and they only have memories of abuse within the school. So what's going on outside the school? But it's the same thing, coming back to what I was saying, it's a paedophile ring. So particular schools, I think, this is a guess because no one's actually going to confirm this but I think you and I and other survivors, we have to be detectives, which none of us effing well want to be. I don't want to be a detective on this, but I have to be. And I figure that pedophiles are attracted to certain schools. In other words, this is a school where you know, there aren't any checks. In other words, where things are pretty lenient, and you know, I go for this school and that school. And so I think that's what happens. So that's why you have two lay teachers. And I should add here, I think this is an appropriate point to mention it, that so 3 years ago, we got one. He was 90. And I was talking about it to, and this is kind of relevant again, I was talking about it to my therapist, who happened, I chose an Irish therapist, because I thought, if I talk to an English therapist about, you know, being offered up to God and being indentured to the Catholic Church, they're going to look at me like I'm some kind of weird fantasist, especially as I write science fiction and fantasy for a living. They're going to say, yeah. So he's letting his imagination run away with him. So I deliberately chose an Irish therapist because I thought, well, she will know. So I don't have to explain all the protocols and all the systems that apply to Catholics. And so I was talking about this teacher who abused me. And the relevant thing is, she said that she had to report it to the police. Now that took me by surprise. And the reason is because she's governed by the laws in Ireland, which, you know, if she hears about abuse, she has a mandatory duty to. I'm not sure if I talked to an English therapist that they would have done. And it hadn't even occurred to me, because at this point, the guy was about 89. And I was saying, I almost measure the level of abuse that they, and the dangers of it by the number of sessions. So this guy was 12 sessions. That's a lot. That's a lot of ranting, right? I can talk about it fairly glibly now, because he's had his 12 sessions. He ain't getting no more. I'm sick of him, right? And she said, well, I have to report that. I said, okay, fine. And I talked to another old boy of a similar De La Salle school, who happened to be a judge. And he said, and I said, do you think I should, you know, because the guy's 88 or something. And without going into details, he basically confirmed that I should. And obviously, as a judge, he'd been there himself and, you know, had dealt with, in other words, doesn't matter, you know, we had these cases of concentration camp guards who are like 90 or something, who end up, it's probably over now, but certainly up to a few years ago. Yeah. So he was arrested, and you can probably see from perhaps the smile on my face that it's a good feeling. I recommend it. It's and I seem to remember at the time, I poured myself a glass of wine and I said, yeah, one down, a lot more to go. So it was good. He was arrested, and this has come as no surprise to you. He turned up with, what do they call him, a responsible adult, his solicitor. I think he may have turned up with a nurse as well. And, you know, so although he was arrested, he wasn't charged, because, you know, once they get into their 80s, you know, I mean, we're all of us aware of some stories where, I'm sure there are, some people who are genuinely suffering from any number of end-of-life complaints. Anyway, the important thing was I got him. So I was, and that was really down to the therapist, because I don't know, I just thought, well, he's 88, what can I do, or whatever. And she said, no, no. And the great thing as well, and this is something that perhaps is useful for survivors, I think it depends what part of the country you live in. Because, you know, I hear from some survivors who say, the police just shrugged their shoulders and told me to go away. They didn't in Ipswich. They did not. And this guy was arrested on the basis of my testimony. Now, I guess some of that must be down to the fact that, you know, it was a good testimony, and they checked with the therapist, and the therapist presumably said, oh, well, I believe him. He's you know, he's not nuts. He's not a fantasist.
When was that? Just sorry to interrupt. When was that? When was he arrested?
About 3 years ago, approximately. Yeah, maybe 2. I have to look it up. Yeah, but and the last I heard, they were checking his NHS records, medical records, to see if what he was claiming, which is obviously they didn't share that with me, but you know, whether it's dementia or something else, or you know, he was obviously not well enough to be charged and face trial. So I think that's journey's end where that's concerned. I don't think at the age of 92 the cops are going to turn around and say, hey, you know, this is going ahead. So I think it's the end of the journey. But I mention it apart from there's a relief in thinking someone, because that's the whole thing, is you want people to believe you. You need to be heard. We, all of us as survivors, we need to be heard. And I think, and this is something that probably may only apply to people who had recovered memories in the 90s. I think it's, again, I'm thinking of things that may be useful. It was my misfortune when these memories came up. So we're talking the early 1990s. And if you cast your mind back to that far off era, this was the era of the False Memory Brigade. The False Memory Brigade were really strong then. In other words, it started off with the American False Memory Foundation, I think they're called, which was really a family dispute where the family were trying to cover up against their brilliant daughter, who's a leading, I've forgotten her name offhand, but you know, a leading writer about psychotherapy and so forth. And then it was caught on in Britain, where I think it's called British False Memory Society. But the significant thing and the sinister thing at that time, and it's still probably the case today, is that they were very powerful lobby. They still are. They have a lot of money. And however that's achieved, they not only have a lot of money, they have very good networking. And so as a result, you will find, if you were to look at that period and later, that the principal newspapers of that time came out in favor of false memory. So they would say, so the stuff I'm talking about, when that first came up, if I occasionally shared it with people, they would almost say as a buzzword, well, maybe that's false memory. There's this thing called false memory. It was invented by, pretty certain, by abusers. It's a term used to defend. Now, of course, there will always be the odd fantasist, and that's happened in more recent years, where you had that wretched guy who was talking about being abused by members of parliament and all that kind of stuff. And who knows how all that works out. There'll always be the odd person like that. But in broad terms, for people like myself to talk about this stuff, you don't talk about it because you really want to. It's, you know, you reach this point rather reluctantly. And anyway, the Guardian and the Mail, both sides of the coin, both were saying false memory, false memory, false memory is ruining families. And so the False Memory Association, the result of that was that they, I think they were called recanters. And so you would have people who would think, I must be a really bad person to be saying that about my grandfather or my grandmother or my mother or whoever it was. And these were actually labeled as recanters. And I didn't know what to make of it, because, you know, I led a pretty happy, successful life up until my 40s, and suddenly all this stuff is just, you know, coming at me. And so I think I did something that's a little unusual. I went and joined them. I went and joined their association, and I went along to a couple of their meetings. And yeah, so I got the inside story, because I thought, I need to understand this. I need to understand what it's all about. The strongest impression of those two meetings I went to was just how much money there was. We are talking upper class here, which is not good. You know what I mean? It's okay. So it's a group of upper class or very wealthy middle class people who are protecting themselves against their awful children who are accusing them of terrible things. Putting that, I mean, today I think false memory has been largely debunked, largely. I mean, you've got one woman who, Professor Loftus, and she's shipped out to all these, it almost is a kiss of death for anyone who's in the dock, because she was the defense witness for Ghislaine Maxwell and for Harvey Weinstein. Yeah. So I think if I was, I think, no, I don't want Loftus. You know what I mean? It's like, it doesn't ring true, because she has no personal experience. She's purely an academic, but she's wheeled out on these occasions, and she comes out with Freudian stuff, and Freud himself is open to question with the way he changed his tune about what the young women of Vienna were accusing their parents of. And then he said, well, it's all a Freudian fantasy, etc., etc. But for me, in the early 90s, I mean, I'm saying this now with a certain confidence and so on, because I've researched this whole subject so well. I really am a kind of expert on it. But I wasn't at the time. It was frightening. It was like, well, could it all be a fantasy? You know, could I be imagining all this? Because I haven't really gone into the details of it. But if I say, you know, we're talking paedophile rings, we're talking Catholic laity, de la Salles, and all this stuff, I think, why would they, you know, I'd ask myself rather naive questions. Why would they spend so much time on me? Why, if I was a difficult little sod, why don't they just tell me to bugger off and find someone more compliant? Mm-hmm. Anyway, the relevant thing, just as a footnote on false memory, is that even to this day, to their shame, the British media do not cover proven examples of recovered memory in the United States. It's a famous case, the Father James Porter, where you had this guy who just happened to be a private detective, Jim Fitzpatrick, I think it was. And he had these memories came back, and he knew what to do with it. And Father James Porter was quite a famous story. Died in prison as a result. But what this detective did as well was listed all the other cases, and there's reams of them in the United States where people have had these recovered memories, and they are not the priests or whoever it is, the parents, are not sentenced just on that alone. They are cross-referenced with other hard evidence. So it completely blows false memory out of the water. But the Guardian, the Daily Mail, I can't swear for the Times because it's behind a paywall, but I'm pretty certain that none of them cover any of the things there. So if you had someone, say a fellow survivor, say from, I don't know, say he's a younger generation than I am. If he doesn't know about this, he's thinking, oh, maybe I'm suffering from false memory syndrome. So it's really important. That, you know, recovered memory, yeah, there are risks to it because our minds don't, I mean, everybody's memory works in different ways. Some are more visual than others. Mine aren't especially visual, which is really annoying for me, especially as a comic book writer. I could really use the visuals and the, you know, and it doesn't come up with right dates and times. It will come up with a feeling first of all, and then you might get a brief flashback, and then you kind of ask yourself questions and the answers come up. That's how it works for me. That's probably because I write for a living. So it's sort of like, you know, you find yourself almost writing it like a diary, only about events that took place, what, some 60 odd years earlier. So anyway, that's that aspect. The school itself was abusive. And another thing I should add, which is relevant to the systemic thing, or organized crime, if you like. And we're talking about the De La Salles here. And it's interesting that this is, it's like as a child, when you remember, you only have the tips of the iceberg. So you remember little things and then you make sense of them as an adult afterwards. And this was a particularly important thing, which proved that the De La Salle abuse, and this is before the De La Salles as we speak, you know, and I'm pressing them for answers, that it proves it was systemic. That there was a particularly notorious abuser who, you know, if you typed him in on Google, you'd probably find a raft of stuff about him. A guy called Brother Solomon, also known as Mike Mercado, also known as the Swinging Monk, because he had a pop career as well. And he just got moved around from, in a classic way. I mean, a lot of this is classic stuff that happens to. So he was at St. Joseph's Ipswich. They switched him to St. Joseph's Beulah Hill, another De La Salle school in London. And then he comes back as a lay teacher, as Mike Mercado later in life. And then he gets chucked out of there as well. In each case, because it's, well, I wouldn't say alcohol-driven abuse. He had an alcohol issue, and abuse was all part of that. So the thing with him, and he abused me, but what I remember with great clarity at the time, and I've checked, and my recollection is 100% accurate. When he got kicked out of St. Joseph's Ipswich, he got sent to De La Salle School in Jersey. And even at the time, even when we're talking about 11-year-old schoolboys, right? Mm-hmm. But even as 11-year-old schoolboys, we knew that this school that he got dunked in Jersey before he went to Beulah Hill was some kind of, what would you call, they would probably call it a retreat. It's a hidey hole. In other words, they keep them out of the way in Jersey until things have calmed down. And so we as schoolboys would joke about how if they're shipwrecked sailors and they came up the shore of the rocky shore of Jersey, and then they would see these De La Salle monks running down the rocks to meet them, and then shipwrecked sailors would run back into the sea, which is a typical smutty, dirty joke that 11-year-old schoolboys come out with. But what does that tell you? It tells you we knew what was going on, and we knew that this place in Jersey was the way it was. And maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, a survivor confirmed to me that he went to a completely different De La Salle school, and he described how there was a rat run from, or what is too polite a word, an underground railroad. It's usually the term when you want to get someone sort of through a secret network, and that's what the De La Salles had. So if a De La Salle brother was an abuser, you would ship him down to the south coast. I think it's the De La Salles had a school there in Bournemouth. And obviously this is going back in time. This is pre-Ryanair. Now you somehow just get on a cheap flight somewhere. But back then it wasn't so easy. So you would go from Bournemouth, let's say, by ferry to the Channel Islands. And then if things were still risky, you would then go across to, I think they would call it the Mother House in France. In other words, and by which point the cops would probably say, oh, we give up. You're talking about the 1960s, the 1970s. How much effort are they really going to put into pursuing paedophiles? They would today, but back then that would probably be enough. And so I've had independent evidence in the last 2 or 3 years that about what I knew at age 11. And whilst that applied to Brother Solomon, it also applied to another notorious paedophile called Brother Kevin, who also went to France via the Channel Islands, and so on and so on. So what you've got is a rat run. And I think rat is the appropriate word, an underground railroad where these people can just be whizzed. So this is systemic. It means they recognize that this is something that's going to happen, and they're obviously okay with it.
And I've heard many stories like this. Alex Renton, when he put his article out in The Guardian in 2014-15, talking about the teacher who abused him was, given was kind of told to leave the school, but he was given a recommendation, and he went on to another secondary school where he abused there, and it was the same school as Boris Johnson. And then you've got other schools where this has happened. I mean, my school, the stories, the same thing. It's like it was before my time. He had already left, but people used to write pedo in ice on this one teacher's car. We used to have sayings like, well, don't go into that person's room because he will bugger you, or backs to the wall because he'll, we had all of these things, and yet we don't listen to the children. And I really can see how we've You know, so many schools do this. Teachers from my school, and I think you mentioned before about the police. I know people from my school went to the police in 2002 and they were just laughed away. They went back 2005, 2006, and they started to make inquiries. They actually listened to them then. But it wasn't until 2016 that suddenly the floodgates opened. And so it's interesting how it's changed now that people are actually taking this on board.
I mean, we're really saying it's only in the last 10 years that things are finally changing. Yeah, it's very late in the day, and obviously too late for so many people who sought justice. And
do you feel, Pat, that the IICSA, which, you know, the last ruling was, say, March, April, but nothing's really been decided, but especially regarding the Catholic abuse, do you feel IICSA dealt with the abuse and it felt like it resolved it?
No.
Okay.
I knew about, I mean, IICSA has been on the go for so long, hasn't it? Because it went through all those changes of the head of the inquiry. And I remember thinking, should I get in touch with them? And the continuous narrative that I'm describing today, I hadn't reached that point. And so that's why I didn't go. But I'm in touch with other survivors, like Raphael Viola. Give a plug for his book.
Oh, wonderful.
Now he went to some kind of De La Salle approved school. So he and I are both survivors of the De La Salles, and I've met up with him. He's a lovely chap. And but he was at IICSA, and what he has to say on the subject is pretty bitter. And you know Joanna Britton as well, who has also talked on the subject. So I've only seen it from the outside, but I don't see anything of merit about it. I think actually I have an insight into that, which is that the Elliott report was commissioned by the Catholic Church to how did they phrase it? I mean, this chap Elliott, I think, is a pretty good guy, and he said, I think, basically, yeah, we have to implement IICSA, and we have to do it in a way whereby we listen to the survivors and interact with them. And if you read the Elliott report, I think you would be impressed by it. You would say, yeah, but it hasn't actually been acted upon. It's been stalled, and we'll get on to Catholic safeguarding in a moment. And Catholic safeguarding is a confused mess. You have one branch of it, the CSSA, which is basically it deals with all Catholic safeguarding issues, as opposed to religious order safeguarding issues. I mean, it can be very confusing for a Catholic survivor, but I can go through that because I think it's, I had to figure it out, and I'd rather someone else didn't have to go through that, you know, because when we approach these organizations, we're usually quite upset and we're angry and we've pushed ourselves and we're saying, right, I'm going to do something about it. And then when you do, and you think, well, who the hell am I meant to be talking to? And why are there all these different initials for all these different people? It's the last thing you want. You want a smooth way in. Anyway, the CSSA, I don't know what he is. I think he's their acting head. I had a reply from him that I'd have to look it up exactly, but the gist of it was, we're you know, he wasn't disparaging about IICSA. He was just saying, I don't know where we go from here. I don't know what we do. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, I'm a survivor and I'm figuring out what to do and how we go forward, just as you are, Piers. But, you know, what you're meant to be the expert. You're getting a salary for figuring this out, you know, and it's so I was quite dismayed by his response. But the other one, the RLSS, is rather better. So I'll come on to that in a moment. But I wanted to mention another aspect of things, which I'm sure must apply to a lot of survivors, alongside the prestige of going to a good school and not wanting to rock the boat and wanting to go to old boys' dinners and all the rest of it, and wanting to be listed in the, you know, glorious alumni, which I'm not, and neither is Jeremy Corbyn's number 2. Was it John McDonnell? I think he was at the same school as me. He's not listed amongst the alumni either because he's a Marxist. So they're not going to have people like him there, are they? But there's another way that I got caught on, and I think and this is one where I really think, and this might be famous last words, I actually have the Catholic Church on the ropes. You got to be optimistic. Who paid my school fees for 9 years? My brother and I had our school fees paid. Now, only in the last 2 or 3 years, and this didn't apply to my brother, under considerable pressure, because bear in mind, I've been assigned to the church. They own me. They wanted me to be a priest. Now, in Irish Catholic society, for your son to be a priest is like the ultimate kudu, especially for a vulnerable Catholic widow like my mother. Probably in other cultures, you know, if your son's a lawyer or a jeweler or something, that's the ultimate thing to go for. But in Irish Catholic society, it's to be a priest. So, you know, that is just going to make all your relatives, you know, green with envy. Oh, you know, my son is Father Patrick. But it was only in the last 2 or 3 years that I subscribed to that under considerable pressure. And I kind of went along with it as 13-year-old boys do. This is a reconstruction, but it rings true to me, and it rings true. Well, I think I probably thought to myself, well, you know, I'll say I want to be a priest and you know, get an education, and then when I get to 17 or 18 or something, I'll say, well, thank you very much, but I've lost my vocation. Probably wasn't that simplistic. I think when you're a teenager, everything's a bit confusing, isn't it? So, you know, it's only now in my ripe old age that I can speak with great clarity, because, you know, I've got a very clear vision of who I am and so on. But nevertheless, it would have been something like that. But as I refused the various sexual advances of people, and as I became a whistleblower, all of which I had a very busy age 13 and age 14. I think it's probably fair to say I was at war with the Catholic Church. And, you know, if you think of a busy year that you might have, it's amazing how much can be packed into 1 year. So anyway, they called my bluff and they said, right, you're going off to a junior seminary at age 15. In other words, shit, you know, they got me banged to rights. And I went along to this seminary, and I mean, it's frustrating for me as a writer, because you know, we love detail. I mean, that's what makes our words come together. But from what I can recall and what the memories that come back, I think I was taken up there on a, what you might call a day trip, not a day trip because it was the other side of the country from Ipswich is down near London, and this place, Cotton, is I think somewhere in the Midlands or the North. And it's quite a well-known junior seminary. And actually I can feel that now because when the memories came up, and they still, you know, memories still come up in recent years. You know, we're only talking maybe 8 months ago, something like that. Absolute bloody terror, effing terror, because I mean, you think about it, it's a junior seminary, so the bottom level would be kids like me, 15, right? And the top layer of the junior seminary would be 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, before they then get shunted on to a more regular seminary. So it's a feeling I had when the memories came up, rather than detail, but the feeling is Lord of the Flies. In other words, well, you think about it, 18-year-old kids who their hormones are going crazy. You know, I mean, it's boarding school, but somehow worse, because they're all celibate, and they've all taken a vow of celibacy. And so that's when I bailed. Now, I think it's just my natural stubbornness that, if you like, I'd acquired from the age of 7 or 8. But I still admire that 15-year-old boy for saying, no, I'm not going. Because the pressure I was under was colossal. Because they can't, it's something that I would venture to say, and I could be entirely wrong here, Catholics are unique in the pressure that they will bring on children. They do not take no for an answer. Now, that may be true of other authoritarian parents elsewhere, but it's especially true. Now, my mother, of course, if you like, she probably was a formidable narcissist, but there's a limit to how much she can do. But of course, what you do is you bring in these characters who act, you know, take on the paternal role. Mm-hmm. So you've got this whole success. One of them was a kind of pseudo stepfather wannabe, but the others, it's basically a series of stepfathers. So you've got all these guys, and I mean, look at it from a class point of view. I'm in a middle-class environment, so I would probably see myself as middle class, but I still live on a council estate. Mm-hmm. And you've got these guys these are from this organization, which is described as the right arm of the church, more like the right fist of the church. In other words, they are they Knights of St. Columba, which in my era was Masonic. It's not anymore. It was too late for me. They stopped being Masonic, or claimed they stopped being Masonic, in around 1968, 69. But we're talking early 60s here. So you've got this succession of people who are lawyers, surveyors, teachers, professional men, because you had to, at that time, I mean, there were some exceptions. There were some blue-collar workers as well. But it was largely seen as an organization of professional Catholic men who paid a tithe to be a knight. Mm. So you're talking money. And these are people, well, you imagine any 15-year-old having to talk to a lawyer, talking to a 15-year-old kid. I still don't quite know how I did it. I still don't, because I think the only thing is that 15-year-old kids, you do have some inner resources, and we can be silly little sods. You know what I mean? We're full of teenage rage and angst, and we want to stop people messing around with us. You know what I mean? It's like it's an animal reaction. I mean, if I think of my cats, you try and do something to a cat it doesn't want. Doesn't matter how much it's going to turn around and hiss and bite you. And so I think my reaction must have been quite animal-like. Because
these knights, sorry to interrupt, these knights, are they trying to get you to go to seminary? Is that what their role was?
Yeah.
Right.
Because it falls within their remit, and this is how it works is this, and this is one of the cloudy areas of how the Catholic Church works, and it's still mysterious today, and I am getting answers, which I'll get onto. But basically, when they say the church paid for your education, what does that mean? I've seen other people do this. John McDonnell had his, the Labour guy. He said, the church paid my school fees. And I thought, yeah, John, same as me, mate. But what does that actually mean? What it means in practice is that the priests give that job to the laity. Now, the laity are the Knights of St. Columba. Now, in other parts of the country, it might be the Catenians. I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced, but Catenians. And various other, but essentially it's in this country, in the UK, it's the Knights of St. Columba. And essentially, as they say, they're described as the right arm of the Catholic Church. So they do all the kind of paperwork and money and so on. So for example, my school, St. Joseph's College, was founded by the Knights of St. Columba. In other words, these are laity who deal with the nitty-gritty. Now you can imagine, well, you probably can't, but it's another rabbit hole, and I won't go too far down it, but it's all about money. Because when you talk about these boarding schools, and this is an important thing, you're talking about a lot of real estate, and a lot of these schools were established a long time ago. They have huge acreage, and sometimes that's developed for housing estates and this and that and the other. So what's all that money about? You will not get answers where the Catholic Church are concerned, although they will have to give me some answers. So they are the ones who paid my school fees, and I have a recollection of this guy, and it's one of those annoying visual things. I can see him with his forgot what they call. It's one of those very flashy fountain pens that probably an antique now. And he's about to write out the check, and all I can see is this gold nib and this black marble fountain pen. And it's, well, do I write out a check? Are you going to be a good boy and please your mother? And I mean, you can imagine all the kind of bullshit that these people come out with. As I say, they're professionals, they're lawyers, they're whatever. So they are the ones who arrange the money. And I have independent evidence on that, which I'm rather pleased about, because people talk about Catholic priests, but they don't talk about the Catholic laity. It's a gorilla in the corner. And I'm not quite sure why that is. I think maybe because, in a way, almost the priests are almost fall guys. Because you see, you've got this eminence gris behind the Catholic Church. These are the people, these are the movers and shakers. Because you think about it, a church goes up, right? Well, who's the architect? Who's the builder? Invariably, you'll probably find it'll be a Catholic one. Well, why not? But do you know what I mean? There's a whole system, there's a whole culture there going on. And sometimes the priests will be involved, but my recollection and my experience is that they and the De La Salle brothers are primarily either have a spiritual task as they see it, or they're academics, they're teachers. Mm-hmm. So they leave all the kind of role of mammon, if you like, mm-hmm. to the knights. And I've got hard evidence on that. So, but the relevant thing here is that whether the form that would have taken, I think in my case, would have been quite, would you say, quite unofficial even then, because the knights are saying they have no records, you know, because they are investigating my case now. Mm-hmm. Well, of course they wouldn't, because it was pretty dodgy even back then. And the church is, you know, when I grilled my relatives on this, they would just use the word the church, like it's some kind of mysterious entity. Well, it's nonsense, isn't it? You know, who is the church? Is it a Catholic priest who says, right, I'm going to write out a check? Where is the money coming from? Where is it stored? It's that classic thing of, I think it's true for so many things in life, follow the money. Mm-hmm. And it's particularly true where the Catholic Church is concerned. And I've had two professionals, one a lawyer and one a reporter, and they both tried to do a deep dive into the finances of St. Joseph's College. And they came up with, well, they were quite confused by the outcome. In other words, it's not straightforward. You know what I mean? If it should be relatively straightforward. After all, it's a philanthropic organization, you would think, with a Christian mission to approve of. But yeah, it's all, whether it's blind trusts or you've got people mortgaging to each other and all this kind of nonsense. And they were really baffled. Mm-hmm. That was the feeling I had. And maths is not my strong point. So I really wish it was otherwise, because I would really like to. It needs a forensic accountant almost to go into the background of these things, because they are well hidden. Mm-hmm. They're going to have to give me some information because they have acknowledged that something's gone wrong. But what I wanted to add as a footnote to this is, this is a serious matter, because whether it's in a more acceptable form, like a scholarship or a bursary or a grant, or God knows what they called it, it didn't have a name, right? But it's putting pressure on children, because it's saying, in crude terms, we're going to pay for your education, and in return, we want you to be nice to father so-and-so, brother so-and-so, or whoever it is. Mm-hmm. And as far as I'm aware, one of the things I've asked the RLSS for is, I want to make sure, this comes on to the issue of children today, mm-hmm. I want to make sure they've stopped doing that. They should not be giving out grants unless it's properly audited with proper protocols in place. Because if someone says, well, we're going to pay for your education, and your mum says, oh, that's brilliant, right? And then you have to be, quote unquote, nice to whoever. Mm. It's a diseased system, and it's relevant for today, because in the global South, the De La Salles are still building schools and still doing things. Well, supposing you're in some part of Africa and they say, hey, you're a bright kid, male or female, and we're going to give you, we're going to pay for your education, so you go on to our grammar school, some kind of elite school. Mm-hmm. And so the kid is going to think, great. And then, depending on whether it's how universal the abuse is or not, someone's going to say it, but we want you to spend some time with father so-and-so or brother so-and-so or whatever. Maybe that doesn't happen. I'm damn sure it does. But where is the protocols to say, where is the safeguarding mechanism to say, well, we did an audit of this, and where's the independent organization? As far as I'm aware, and we can come on to this at this time, they mark their own homework. And the opportunities for abuse with scholarships, because that's basically what I was a victim of. And hence why when I said, after I had visited Cotton, I'm out of here, I am not doing this. And they said, well, if you don't go to this school, if you don't do what we're asking, you will be out on your ear. And I must have said, being a bolshy 15-year-old, do your worst. And they did. And I was out on my ear at 15 years old, pre-O-levels.
Thank you, Pat. Do you feel the system's changed? So, if we come on to the Catholic Church now, how have they dealt with the claims of sexual abuse, and has it changed?
I think the Elliott report has shown that they haven't. The CSSA, its response to the Elliott report and to IICSA means that they haven't changed. The example I've given of Raphael Viola is a case in point, where he says in his book, and I met him a couple of weeks ago, which is why he's very much on my mind.
I think I saw the photo on your Twitter, actually. On your blog, either one.
Right. Yeah. He went to a De La Salle approved school and was really messed up by these people. Now his children and I think it's his sister's children are all high flyers. They all went to university. They've all got very successful jobs. But the Catholic appointed psychiatrist who saw Raphael reduced the offer of what he had been subjected to a minuscule figure, because they said, well, he genetically he came from a background where he would have ended up with a poor, not more than a poor start in life. He was genetically predisposed towards a terrible life. Now, I'm going into bat for Raphael, because when I heard this, I thought, wait a minute, this sounds like eugenics. And so I'm waiting to read the full details, but there is the bits I have read do sound like eugenics, which as far as I was concerned, I thought was illegal. You can't. But anyway, so that's the position on that. I mention it in summary here, simply to say, no, the Catholic Church is still fighting as hard as it can. And there's one exception. So, well, first of all, the Elliott report is good, because but that has not been actioned by the CSSA. I won't go into detail because it would take too much time, and I'd rather talk about something more positive. The CSSA does not impress me. Now, the RLSS, and these initials drive you nuts, and it stands for something like Religious Life Safeguarding System, something like that. Now so in terms of, well, where are we today? So if, for example, you've got a survivor watching this and they were, let's say, taught by the Jesuits or the Benedictines or the De La Salles or any other Catholic religious order, the RLSS is the place to go. Now, it's still not as good as it should be, because the first thing we should always ask ourselves as survivors, because we have to do their damned homework, because they won't tell you, who funds the RLSS? And I can tell you the answer. It's the religious orders involved. So the De La Salles fund their own safeguarding, right? I think the Jesuits are with the RLSS, but I can't swear to it. Benedictines fund the RLSS. Now, at the same time, the RLSS believe that they can still be objective. Now, I think because they are genuinely good people, and that I will swear to, because I've spoken to them and so on, and they ring true to me. But even so, when I've had a client rings me up and says, well, we want you to do a talk about this or that, well, I'm indebted to the person who's going to pay me. And I'm not going to turn around and write something very negative about that person. So it's not, it should be independent. I mean, all these things should be independent, and of course it exasperates a lot of survivors. My take on it is we have to work with what we've got. Of course it should be independent, but I'm working, and this might sound a little desperate on my part. These people are genuine. I think it sometimes happens in even the most corrupt and evil organization, and that's my description of the Catholic Church, without a doubt. It's a corrupt and evil organization. We won't have time to get into canon law, I think, but canon law unequivocally means you're dealing with a kind of religious equivalent of the mafia or something. But the RLSS, these people are genuine. And so they're trying to work within the system. Now, so I'm trying to work with them within the system. So they've responded to my complaints about the Knights, and they've got the Knights to the point where the magic word apology is being quoted. And whether we go the distance or not, there's apologies and apologies. What I don't want is, well, we have no records of anything, but if you say it happened, then we believe you and we're really sorry. That will not do. I want an apology where, yeah, we did some terrible things back then and we are truly sorry for them. And most important of all, it ain't going to happen again. Now, again, coming back to your question, is it still going on? Sadly, the answer is yes, it is. I think these people, we've almost got to wait another generation for whoever is being harmed to reach their 40s, as I did, you know, whatever, for these memories to come up. And that makes me really sad. But I have documented evidence, and it's one of the things I've brought to the attention of the RLSS. And it does exasperate me a bit because, you know, I write science fiction for a living. I'd much rather be living in La La Land rather than playing detective. But I've had to play detective because the RLSS is holding the ring. It's not investigating as strongly as I would like. But nevertheless, they are good people. They're not dishonest. And could be famous last words. So you have the Knights of St. Columba. You had an organizer that we are talking, what are we talking? From memory, 6 years ago. This guy now is serving somewhere between 20 and 30 years for child abuse. Wow. He used his position as a Knight of St. Columba to abuse children at organized events. So 5 or 6 years ago, we're still in the current zone. But the worst of it is that he had previously, I think it was in the 70s, he had previously been charged with child abuse. So this is a guy who, you know, has taken on this role, who does not have any DBS checks. And so as a result, children some 5 or 6 years ago. I think the prison sentence was something like 20 years, at least 20 years. That's bad. You know what I mean? We are not talking about anything, you know, one-offs. We're talking really bad stuff, which was not covered in the press. That brings me on to another issue, which, you know, some of these things, by the way, I will have to let go because, you know, you can get too, you know, I mean, I write for a living. I prefer writing to investigating the Catholic Church, so I have to strike a balance. But the press, it didn't make the national press, which I was very upset about. I mean, I'm calmer about it now. But I mean, something like that, 20-year stretch, you know, it should make the national press. It didn't. It barely made the local press. So we are talking, rather like with the British Sports Memory Society, we are talking people with contacts and who make things happen. Another example.
I've heard about that in.
What?
I've heard about that with my school, that there was an article about abuse going into the Times, and one of the lead Masons from the lodge, which was associated with my school, contacted them, and it was pulled. So I've heard this, and this is just a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Well, another example that bears this out as well. I mean, when I first came across these things, it was almost a relief, because I was looking for evidence to think, why would all these weird guys want to spend so much time? But it's how the whole recruiting thing works. They invest in their future. You know, it's transgenerational, and they can't. And there's a lot of ego, there's a lot of pride. I mean, you'd have thought they'd have just thought, God, he's an annoying little brat. Let's tell him to bugger off. And they don't think like that. And that's very hard for me to get my head around, because, you know, if I was pressing for an answer on something from someone and they were resisting, my natural thought would be, okay, move on. And that feels like a normal, healthy thing. They aren't like that, these people. Catholic Church is not like that. It does not give up. I could quote loads of examples, but I should mention another one that, pursuant to what you were saying about the Times. Jimmy Savile. Now, Jimmy Savile was definitely a papal knight, and was almost certainly a knight of St. Columba. His close associates who've been brought out as sexual abusers, Catholic sexual abusers, almost certainly were knights of St. Columba. The guy, got an Italian name, he's an ice cream king or something in Blackpool, who was had a close relationship with Savile, and there were a couple of others. Anyway, as you know, when the Savile thing broke, just about everybody who was remotely involved with him was rightly investigated. BBC, Broadmoor, the Stoke Mandeville Hospital, all those areas that he was involved in. He was involved with the Knights. Nothing. And you know how they got away with it? Well, let me take you back to the funeral. I think it's only on my website, and maybe if you do a lot of hunting, you would find it elsewhere. The Knights of St. Columba officiated at Jimmy Savile's funeral. So you'll see them with their Masonic sort of badge thing. Mm-hmm. But it was never featured in the press. As I say, it's just a blackout on it. So someone has pulled the plug on that and said, we don't want these pictures of the Knights. So if for instance, you wanted to look something up on the Knights, remarkably, my site, I think, is about the only one that's likely to come up. You won't find anything else. They are, you know, they are as, what should we say, as holy or as committed to children as the other awful organization, the Boy Scouts of America, who've been exposed recently as the most appalling setup. I suppose what it comes down to is wherever people can get hold of children, they're going to go into those professions or into those organizations, whether it's a boarding school or, you know, the knights say that they are there. I don't know if they actually use these words, but tantamount to, which of course is a red rag to a bull for me. They're there to, you know, help widows and children. And of course, that's their cover story. As you know, in my case, my mother, who was sort of very vulnerable and just prime target for them, and they got it wrong with me. But there are still no DBS checks. That's the relevant thing.
Really? Even now?
No, I've asked the RLSS specifically on this. I have an insider, someone who could have been harmed by the Knights of St. Columba, a vulnerable person, vulnerable for other reasons, and they've asked me to maintain confidentiality. But this person has said that in this other diocese, there are no DBS checks on them. Now, the example I gave of this guy who was sentenced to 20 years, a knight. Now, if he'd been given a DBS check, what shall we say, in the last 10 years, it would have come up that he had previously, in the 1970s, been an abuser and had been sentenced. The details on it are very thin, but they are there. So I have asked the RLSS on, I think, 2 or 3 occasions now. This isn't just about me wanting justice for me. I want to make sure that if these knights are, I mean, they do things like run, I think they run a youth hostel, they'll take children on outings to the seaside, deprive children, all this kind of stuff. It's classic opportunities for abusers. Now, if everyone's got a DBS check, it substantially reduces the risk. Doesn't completely eliminate it, but at least it's, and I haven't had an answer to that yet. So I suppose I have to say, you'll be thinking, yeah, so what good do the RLSS do? They first of all, I did an interview with them, which is on my website. And my website, by the way, is Pat Mills, all lowercase one word, .wordpress.com. I'm sorry it's not as well organized as it should be, but that's because I do this stuff, but it's like Raphael says with Stealing Lives. I kind of resent how much time I should spend on it, because what I want to be doing is either writing stories or weeding the garden or doing, going out and having a drink with friends. And I think, no, I'm not going to turn this into some comprehensive system, because it can consume your life. Anyway, on the positive side, where the RLSS is concerned, I did an interview with the head, I think it's Danny Wardman, I think. And it's the first time that a survivor has actually talked to a head of a safeguarding agency. And we talked for about an hour and 15 minutes. And I asked her some very hard-hitting questions. It's not my finest hour as an interviewer, and I'll tell you why. Because I had to keep, and I seem to have managed it here, but I think at the time I was quite angry. This is maybe 6-8 months ago. And I had to keep stopping myself from swearing, finding other words. And so there's a fair number of ers and ums on it, which kind of, it's very information dense. So anyone who's looking at it, I kind of listed the high points. So if you find the whole thing boring, I can totally understand that. But there are interesting things there that were previously not known by Catholic survivors, and perhaps survivors in general. And I just mention a couple of them. They can arrange for a face-to-face with a representative of the organization. So in my case, it'd be a de la Salle.
Mm-hmm.
So if I wanted to, and at some point I probably will, I could do a Zoom, for instance. I mean, I live in Spain. I'm not coming back to Britain to take a plane journey just to cover this, but I can actually have a face-to-face and say, look, this is what your order did to me. This is, the harm that you did, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's not generally known. That's not in the Elliott report. And there's several other things like that that are useful to know. Now, she said, and there were other positive things that she said in that interview. As I say, it's incredibly dense. It's an hour full of Wikipedia type material. And so I think I've listed on the blog somewhere, look, there are 7 high points on this. So if the thing you're interested in is item 3, just skip the rest and just go for that.
I have read that, actually. I've been through your blog and I've seen the list of those 7 things. I think it was over the weekend.
I think it was the thing I was pleased about on it was this is the first time a survivor has, for want of another word, confronted the enemy. I mean, she's not personally the enemy, but the opponent, if you like. And I think there should be a lot more of it. I think there's a lot of us who are quite good at talking to these kind of people. And I really wanted to follow up with others. I would like to, I actually do know a canon law theologian, and at some point I would like to do that. But as I say, doing normal things takes priority. I am not going to give up my life to, but at some point, and I think we should encourage, as survivors, we have these skills, and we should say to the headmaster, for instance, of a school that's been abusive, talk to us, talk on Zoom. Why are you so effing scared? The St. Joseph's College at Ipswich, for example, they wouldn't talk to me, because what they would say is, we are no longer de la Salle, we are a Catholic school, but we are, I think I forced them to take down a sign. That was the inciting incident for me. I walked past my old school and there was a sign outside which said, in the Lassallean tradition. And I thought, no, I'm not accepting that. Because what does that mean? For me, in the Lassallean tradition means it's, you can do what the hell you like with children. No, you cannot say that, because the Lassallean tradition in Ipswich, at this school and probably elsewhere, is one of criminal abuse. And you cannot say that. And I believe they've taken it down. So it's a small victory. Another thing I wanted to mention, a positive thing about the RLSS, apart from they got DBS checks on the Caldey Island monks, who previously were saying we're above all that kind of stuff, get stuffed. And I think that was very important to the Caldey Island survivor. So that's a result of the RLSS. In other words, they want to do, how she phrased it is, we want to do the right thing. And this brings me on to just one thing I must mention, because it's something that I have a problem with, and I think all survivors have a problem with, and I don't think it's very rarely talked about, but I think it's really important. And I don't know the answer because I'm as human as every other survivor. It came out in the conversation as we were talking, and I suddenly realized what she was getting at, although she didn't, I'm ad-libbing on what she was saying. These abusers, or the organizations, whether it's a school, like the one you're referring to, or the de la Salles, or the Benedictines, or any number of organizations, they're scared, they're frightened. And of course, my natural reaction as a survivor is, good, they need to be scared. But there's something else that's important here. And that is, in order to get them to talk and to admit and to acknowledge what they've done, oh, maybe not them specifically, but their organization, and they've been covering up. So it isn't just a bunch of guys who died 30 years ago. You know, they've been covering up for these people for in recent years. So covering up is pretty bad as well. So they feel scared. Now, if I'm scared, if most of us are scared, our natural reaction is to get kind of hard about it and go, oh, I'm not speaking to you, or I have nothing to say. That's a normal reaction. And so in a way, it's a paradox that I don't think sits comfortably with any of us survivors. We actually have to make them feel safe, which is a real paradox, because that's the one thing they damn well didn't do for you and I. They did not make us feel safe. But we, and it's almost like some weird karmic law here, we actually have to make them feel safe. Mm-hmm. I would much rather incline to the blunt instrument approach, where you just say, no, just give it up. Mm-hmm. But I could see what Danny was getting at, that for some of them, if you want to get a result, you've got to, it's good cop, bad cop. Maybe that's, and it's unfortunate that we have to learn these skills or consider these skills mm-hmm. and apply them. Anyway, I thought it was important to say that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is. It's like that, coming at them with compassion and
yeah. It's hard to feel compassion for organizations that have callously lied and hidden things and shown no fellow feeling. It's very hard.
I think it is, but I think what the Buddha said, I spent some time in a Buddhist monastery, the Buddha said it's like, it's us who are holding the hot coal of anger or hatred or jealousy, and it's us who's being burnt. It's not the other person. It's not the DeSalle brothers. It's not my boarding school. It's like, it's us. So unless I learn to let it go and have compassion, then it burns me. And that's what happened. And I see that with a lot of survivors. We get sick, we burn out, we have breakdowns like I did. So I realized time, we've been talking almost a couple of hours. So
have we? Oh my God, sorry about that.
So just as we start to wrap up, I'd love for you to maybe share some of the positive steps you can to leave it on a positive. What can we do? What can we, what do you recommend, having done this work for quite a long time?
Well, I think, number one, consider the RLSS if you're a Catholic. Even if the abuse was some kind of, not necessarily at a boarding school, but was something akin to it. One of the things Danny said is, we will sort it out. It's not your problem to work out which of these pretty stupid initials. Doesn't matter. They'll sort it out. And I thought that was very generous of her. And I put her to the test, and she's come up with the result. So I think that's the first thing. Second thing, there's the obvious thing about reporting to the police. If it's systemic abuse, it comes under the police thing, Operation Hydrant. I've experienced of Operation Hydrant. It's been good. Other survivors have had bad experiences with Operation Hydrant. So it seems to be a regional thing. If you happen to be in a particular, Ipswich for some reason is a good place for the cops. You could be in Blackpool or somewhere and it's not. But obviously that's a strong one to consider. Third thing is to write it, or obviously if you've got a different creative skill, paint or play it out of your system. But if writing it out of your system is a good one. that's why I do the blog. And if you go back a few years on the blog, you'll find on particular days where the thing was really hitting me right between the eyes, that's what I do. And I'm sharing this stuff and saying, this is poison and it's going out there. This is poison that belongs to these dreadful Catholic criminals. So I regularly have guest blogs, and I encourage people, and I've got, I'm quite pleased about this. I haven't reached a kind of private eye level, but I'm not bad. I've got a couple of insiders who've been giving me stuff on the mechanisms of power, if you like. And so, anyone who's got that kind of, wants to share that stuff, wants to use my blog, very welcome. Or if they just want to howl in of some words, that's also okay. I can't recall a time where I've ever edited it, but sharing stuff is really valuable. Or set up your own blog. And the other thing, which I have not done, because as I say, there's too many other things in life, but I do admire Raphael. This is print on demand book. In other words, it's self-published. Now, a lot of people might feel, I don't know, that they couldn't do a lot of my stories now are self-published because I have much more creative freedom. And if I had the time, I would obviously write about the stuff we've been talking today. But as you can see, it's 2 hours already. My God, it's going to be a really thick book. I dare not go there. I don't know how I could stop, So it's like, no, don't go there. But other people, they might be able to focus just on 1 or 2 experiences and publish their book. And there are a number of survivors' books out there. And the more of us who are coming out with it, I think is good. Because, well, it shows that I think the period of time where it was kind of shameful or embarrassing, I think we've gone past that point now. I think, the various things that happen in the media, even as we speak, people are much more open about talking about this. And yeah, I think we've got, I think that's a good way. It's very hard to get the national media interested in it for the reasons I've given, and you probably know this yourself. You've got people like Alex Renton, because he's got contacts in the media. He's perhaps one of the exceptions. But generally speaking, it's very hard, and the Catholic press is very tied up. But these are all things I'm actually pressing with the RLSS and saying, well, look, why don't we have, and she was responding to that and saying, well, yeah, there could be a survivors column in the Catholic Herald, which is a great idea. So each,
I wonder if that could happen, but
yeah, well, I haven't followed her up on that. And the reason you can probably guess, because I've got so many other things to harass her with, it's like, okay, I've made a note of that, but I think it's an important one. In the national press, okay, it's the Catholic national press, it's still important, it's still read. For a survivor to be able to write about what happened to them, and then the next week is a different survivor and so forth. Right. But she suggested that to me, so I'm encouraging her in that respect. Another thing I've suggested to her is like a Mumsnet. You know how Mumsnet covers, I mean, you think of the subjects that we've covered, and we've had to skim over some of them very quickly because, but obviously with something like Mumsnet, so it's SurvivorNet or Catholic SurvivorNet, you can get into these things in great detail. And I know if I put my mind to it, I could set something like that up, but I am not going to do it. You can kill yourself by just, I mean, you must, ration yourself on these things as well, because otherwise it can take you over. But I'm pleased to say that Birmingham has, there's a survivors net in Birmingham. It's actually taken up the idea in the interview. So, that's the kind of thing that might appeal to someone because then you get this information exchange. Because that's one of the things for us as survivors. It's possible someone watching this now knows more about false memory than they did before. And there might be someone else who comes along and says, well, actually, Pat, there's a new development on this. And so we all exchange information, and we because we need to, because the organizations that we're up against are going to try to keep us away from the truth. It's whether it's just a reflex or whether it's passive aggression, I don't know. I think it's a bit of both. There's certainly there are passive aggressives, certainly amongst the De La Salles on earlier rounds. So yeah, I obviously didn't make them feel safe. There you go.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Pat. I think, really bless you for the work you're doing. And, what I invite people to do is go and visit Pat on his website. I'll put that into the description, and I'll put in the RLSS website as well into there. So, they can contact if they want to reach out. But yeah, thank you so much for your conversation today. It's been very insightful. What a journey you've been on. So bless you for your work.
Well, thank you. It's as always, it's cathartic sharing it, and because it's so complex, it gets kind of compressed. And I suddenly realized that I'm talking. My God, I've been talking for 2 hours about this stuff, and you realize just how much there is, and of course that also applies to other people. But most important of all is we don't want this to happen to any more children. We do not want these scum to get their hands on a new generation of children. We want them to keep their innocence. Yeah, there you go.
Well, thank you, Pat. Okay.
Thanks.